The first thing I ever did when I stepped off the truck and stood on that cracked dirt drive was lay my hand on the fence post and feel the grain felt like answering an old, stubborn question. 2 days later, somebody drove a chain through my gate at midnight and left a laminated notice nailed to the post telling me I didn't own the land I'd just bought. That's the short version. The rest unfolds the way these things do, slow at first, then fast, like a bruise that keeps widening until you can't pretend it won't hurt. My name is Hank Mercer. I'm 57, retired from a life of measuring lines that other people thought were invisible, a surveyor for 30 years, the kind of job that makes you good at reading maps and very bad at trusting printed words unless you've seen the metal pin in the dirt. I bought the place because I wanted room for my bad knees and a garden where I could grow things that didn't come with HOA rules attached. A place called Willow Bend Hollow, an old cattle lot that even the county had forgotten. It was cheaper than renting a life with rules, and I liked the silence. I liked the way the wind in the cottonwoods sounded like a neighbor's whisper, and I thought, maybe, finally, I'd found a corner of the world that wasn't ruled by clipboard men in khakis. The clipboard man arrived 2 weeks after the papers changed hands. Evelyn Kincaid showed up in a car too clean for the county road, nails done, a collar that could order people around without speaking much, and a smile that had learned how to look like a favor. She introduced herself as president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, a bureaucratic-sounding title that, in her mouth, had teeth. Mr. Mercer, she said, we noticed some irregularities with your parcel and wanted to clarify membership. She wore those words like they were a courtesy. The courtesy was a demand. The first time she told me clarify, I thought she meant a map. By the time she left, I knew clarify meant membership dues, covenants, and the idea that my land might be somewhere her people said it was, not where the deed and the pins in the ground said it was. You learn things about people when you let them stay in your head for too long. I learned Evelyn had operated like an expanding line on a map, polite where it helped, dishonest where it paid. I learned her son, Mason, was the kind of man who could turn a passive look into a threat. I learned the HOA's board papers had more in common with corporate minutes than neighborly resolutions, and I learned why someone like Evelyn never owned anything that couldn't widen into money. Act 1 is always about the ordinary life being interrupted and about the choices that look small at first and enormous later. I kept my head down. I did the nuts and bolts stuff, put up a mailbox, located the remaining boundary posts I could find, dug for the old iron pin my grandfather had told me would be there. I had deeds. I had the county's records. I had a rusty transit in the back of the truck and the muscle memory to run a line as true as a breath. When the HOA sent me the first letter, a polite demand masked as a friendly notice, it was stapled to a glossy letterhead and signed by a name I'd never heard. Someone who claimed the county had reissued a plat that moved my deed line. They attached an image that looked like a jumble of lines and fonts, the kind of PDF anyone could make look official. It was a small thing, a document. It was also the wedge. Your purchase crosses into the Willow Ridge jurisdiction, the letter said. Please remit membership dues within 30 days to avoid penalties. I almost laughed. You don't spend 30 years of your life learning how to find pins in the ground to be shaken by a PDF. But the laugh caught in my throat when I pulled the gate closed at night and saw tire tracks that hadn't been there earlier, heavy truck treads toward the back pasture where I'd been clearing brush. I set trail cams like an old man setting salted fish, more to prove that I'd seen it than to trap anything. The cams caught a lot of suburbia's ugly habits. A crew with a hired excavator pulling up the long-dead fence lines that had marked the lot for a century, men with county vests on, voices clipped, moving where they had no business moving. When the generator died in the middle of the night, the cable snipped with something clean and precise. I stopped thinking of this as a neighborly disagreement. The sheriff took the report and smiled, that polite sheriff smile. We'll look into it, he said, which, in county thinking, sometimes means they document the thing so paper can stare at the problem and feel it's doing something. It wasn't until my lawyer arrived, Riley Torres, quick, sharp, and blunt as a field shovel, that things shifted toward a plan. Riley looked at the trail cam footage, at the receipts for the rents the HOA had charged the neighborhood, at the PDF that supposedly moved my line. It's paper, she said. It's theater. But it's dangerous theater. That's when we started to assemble what lawyers call the ordinary miracles: witnesses, records, a professional survey. Act 2 is the part where the story gets greedy, where the stakes multiply because someone else thinks they can rewrite the rules. We hired Anita Flores, a state-licensed geodetic surveyor who smelled like a library and wore boots like she'd been storming basements for a living. Anita came with a metal detector and a patience that makes patience look like a hobby. She found iron pins where they should be. She read the old benchmarks like people read faces. When she finished, she offered me the kind of look surveyors give when the truth is plain. Your property line is not where the HOA claims it is. That should have settled it. But paper is louder when it's printed, and someone with power wants your vegetables. The HOA's people men who smiled the way a lock smiles at a key showed up with a crew one morning and started trenching along what they claimed was their right-of-way. The trench cut through an old willow that I'd planned to keep for shade, and when I asked them why, a man with a clipboard shoved a laminated sheet at me and said, "You're on the wrong side of this, Mr. Mercer." The laminated sheet was the same PDF, now stapled to the gate of the excavator. It's funny how power likes laminates makes fake things feel permanent. There was a particular night I still carry like a stone. I'd been up late, drinking coffee with the window open because the night felt like it might listen. The trail cam sent an alert at 2:13 a.m. and my phone glowed with a video of a silver pickup backing up toward the barn, a figure moving in the dark like a shadow that knows the ground. The figure was Mason, Evelyn's boy, broad shoulders, the kind of jaw that looks like it could bite someone's pride clean off. He lit a cigarette with hands that had no visible nervousness, and then he walked to the generator, and he spoke into the dark in a voice that made my blood move slower. "You should have taken the letter more seriously," he said. The recording had him close enough for the cigarette glow to cut the night. I replayed it against the hum of my cooling coffee and thought, by God, a man could be arrested for going around making other people's lives smaller. We built a wall of things that anger and paperwork could not demolish. Riley filed for an injunction based on fraud and trespass. Anita filed a sworn survey that showed, on paper and by pin in the ground, where Willowbend ended and Willow Ridge began. A whistleblower surfaced. Her name was Beatrice Lang, a retired accountant who had been the HOA's treasurer for 16 years and who had kept receipts like someone keeping a diary. Bea drove out one autumn morning with a thermos and a folder and sat on my porch and told me, in a voice made of cracked gravel, that she had kept the ledgers because she had never believed the numbers Evelyn printed. "I kept the math," she said, and when she opened the folder, the math spilled like a confession. BEA's paper trail showed money going from HOA accounts into shell accounts, disguised as landscaping fees and community outreach. The shell accounts paid vendors with names that traced back, eventually, to a company listed under Evelyn's sister's name. The deeper we dug, the more it looked like a creature made of small, greedy decisions, small fees, big changes, a few hammered nails where a map needed a pin. There was one ledger marked, Boundary Adjustment Kincaid Initiative, and the numbers beside it were clean. Someone had paid for an adjustment, not a surveyed change, but a pocketbook change meant to bless the fiction. People like Evelyn don't go down easily, they twist. She came to my property one afternoon with a lawyer and a camera crew from a regional lifestyle channel, and she smiled in that way and said, "We're just clarifying boundaries for everyone's safety." The camera wanted the narrative of simpler folk needing simpler rules. I walked her while the lens recorded and told her, quietly, that safety doesn't come by stealing a neighbor's trees. Her face tightened, and she said, half teasing, "You sound like you own the map." "I own the pins in the ground," I said. "I own the pin my grandfather sunk." She looked at me like I'd cited the wrong him. There was poetry in that moment, a stupid kind of justice. The old man who read metal and the woman who read bank statements. Both of us holding different kinds of truth. We staged a sting because sometimes the law needs a shove. The conservation route came from Dr. Nathaniel Sloan, an academic with a tendency to speak like he was narrating his own lectures. Nathaniel had been doing water studies in the area and was interested in Willowbend for ecological reasons no one in the HOA boardroom could see beyond a grant number. He thought if the land could be documented as a habitat for an endangered wetland insect, and his grad students did the math and the nights of counting and the samples, then federal protections could temporarily prevent the kind of maintenance the HOA was trying to impose. We set a sign that said, absurdly and bureaucratically, "Temporary study site federal permit pending," and left it by the trail. It was a lie dressed like a fact. Mason came, a week later, with his crew, and when he began to dig near the wet spot they insisted was dry, the cameras caught him. He cursed the sign, pushed it down, and tore his glove. The complaint to the county came fast once a federal sounding agency was mentioned. The very thing Evelyn had counted on to be invisible was now a hornet whose nest had been disturbed. There was a hearing. That's how these things look on paper: a judge's name, a date, a motion, a countermotion. But in the courthouse the thing became human. In the gallery sat the people who had been herded into Willow Ridge. 2 men who lost their sheds because they didn't pay voluntary landscaping fees. A woman who had moved her mother into a house that was suddenly subject to fines for visual clutter. On the other side sat the board members who'd learned too little and said too much. Evelyn sat like a queen waiting for a verdict and wore a face that said, "Tomorrow will be easy." Riley did the slow burn in court, the kind of lawyer people think only exists in movies. She stood up and spoke without grand gestures, just facts that were small enough to be true and heavy enough to matter. She showed the survey pins. She showed trail cam footage of Mason at the generator. She cross-examined a vendor until his answers were holes in his earlier story. The judge, an older woman with a soft voice and quick hands, asked simple questions that felt like a metronome for fairness. Evidence moved like water in a channel. It found the place it wanted to go. When the judge signed a temporary injunction halting the HOA's projects on my land and ordered expedited discovery of the HOA accounts, the courtroom sat like it had been holding its breath. That's the high point. The gavel, the ink, the relief, but also the knowledge that law can be patient and slow and still work. Evelyn didn't crumble. She sharpened. She called a press conference and cried about overreach, about small communities under threat from outsiders. It's a tactic that has been used since people started of calling things community to hide money. She had people who believed her, and when your narrative gets loud enough, nuance drowns. The press wanted a story that fit its pattern: old man versus HOA, David versus Goliath. They filmed my barn and made a short segment on somebody who wanted to keep everything his way. The camera loves tidy stories. Things did not end in the courthouse. Discovery unspooled emails and bank transfers that smelled of the same underlying thing: consolidation of power disguised as community improvement. There were names in the threads that linked Evelyn to a county clerk who had signed off on amended plats with shaky handwriting and hurried dates. The DA's office took an interest, and then the FBI came in like a summer storm, all at once and serious, and they pulled records and hard drives in a way that made the HOA board look like a nest under a boot. Mason, who had never needed anyone to explain consequences to him, suddenly needed to pick his phone up with a lawyer on the line. There were indictments, counts of fraud, embezzlement, falsifying public records, words that on their own are small letters, but when you put them together make a long sentence that breaks a person's day into before and after. Act 3 is the part where we count what's left and decide whether what we do is repair or revenge. The order from the judge stood: no more trenching, no more claims on Willowbend until the matter was resolved. The county restored some pins that had been quietly moved, and Anita and I walked each boundary and laid the stakes down like little flags on a map that had been arguing with itself for years. The federal study designation Nathaniel pushed for became real enough to be a buffer, while an audit untangled the money. The whistleblower testimony cemented the pattern: little fees becoming big holes in neighbors' bank accounts, ledger entries that were more fiction than bookkeeping. Evelyn's empire didn't fall overnight. Cover stories were written about power and small-town politics, and a few neighbors called her brave for trying to clean up the subdivision. Some people saw her as a catalyst for order. Others saw the same set of receipts be had brought to my porch and felt something like betrayal. Mason pleaded out to a misdemeanor for trespass and damage to property. Evelyn faced a long set of hearings that would, in time, cost her reputation and her ability to continue running an organization that blurred private profit and civic duty. The DA offered settlements, and the HOA dissolved as a legal entity and reformed under stricter rules, with oversight and a new board elected by the membership, the kind of procedural fix that still felt like a victory, even if it was small and bureaucratic. After all that, after judges and cameras and the long cold mornings of paperwork, I came home and planted an apple tree where the trench had been. I did small things, the kind of human things that stitch a place back together. Toasted the straps of the old barn, fixed the generator with a new plug, and put my hand on that same fence post and felt the grain. The land healed in ways that land always does when you stop making it fight. The wildlife returned, as wildlife does when the noise settles. The creek ran and taught me patience. People came to apologize, to trade a story, to hand me a jar of honey in a way that felt like trading currency for peace. But endings are messy, and so mine needed to be too. There was justice of a certain kind, accountability in deposits and in court transcripts. But there was also the hard truth that systems make people into something else, into instruments of a particular kind of order that's blind to neighborliness. I didn't get a parade. I got a quieter thing. Neighbors who finally looked at their deeds and at their ledgers, who voted again and read meeting minutes with a wariness that was not cynicism but care. There's a scene I keep coming back to, that I tell people when they ask what it felt like to win. Evelyn came back to Willowbend the day the new board was sworn in. She walked to the edge of my property and stopped and watched. Mason stood behind her, a shadow that had been softened by the law into something more human. She didn't speak to me. She looked at the pasture and at the willow and at the apple tree I'd planted. There was a moment where she looked like someone who had misread the map of her own heart. Maybe she had. Maybe she never saw the difference between holding a place and holding power. You could say this is a story about land or law, or how a PDF and a laminating machine can threaten a life. You could say it's about the arrogance of people who believe maps are only lines on paper, not the promises in the ground. For me, it's about the way truth can be small and patient and absolutely stubborn pins in the earth. A woman who kept ledgers because she couldn't help herself. A surveyor who still remembers how to read a steel rod under a foot of dirt. And it's about the fact that you can get steely and legal without losing your humanity if you remember why you wanted the quiet in the first place. If you take anything from this, let it be the little practical thing. Know your records. Know your pins. If someone hands you a document that sounds like a demand, check the ground. It's also okay to build a little theater for truth. Sometimes you have to dress a sign up, like a federal study, to make people notice. That's not the part I'm proud of. It's the part that worked. What I'm proud of is the apple tree, the work, the way the creek hums when I'm out there at dawn. I'll tell you this because I want you to understand how ordinary this felt, even in the middle of the chaos. Once the swirl of lawyers and cameras and criminal filings settled down, I sat on my porch with a thermos and watched a neighbor kid chase a dog off the dirt road and thought about how many fights in life are about wanting the same empty thing to be seen as in control. We used to think power looked a certain way: big suits, loud voices. Evelyn's legal fate was left to the courts and the prosecutors who found patterns in her receipts. I was left to my hands and my land. My apology to someone who believed in her was quick and honest. There are people who still won't speak to me because they thought my ways were too loud. That's okay. I prefer people who are loud for truth to those who are quiet for convenience. Before I close, and I'll close because even stories have their bedtime, I want to ask you something. If you were standing on the other side of this fence, what would you have done? Would you have sat back and let an HOA redraw a boundary with a PDF and a smile? Or would you have stood and fought like a man who remembers where the pins are? Was what we did right? Or did it overstep? Is the law enough to protect the small and the stubborn? Or does it require theater to get attention? Tell me where you come down, leave it in the comments. Say which side you're on, and tell me about a time your own neighborhood surprised you.